Okay, imagine this for a second. A nation where the calendar doesn't start at year zero or, with the birth of Christ, but
Yeah.
with the birth year of its founder.
Yeah, it's pretty striking. It really shows you how deeply a country's philosophy can be embedded right down to how they see time itself.
Absolutely. And that embedding, that deep philosophical root, is exactly what we're going to explore today. We're taking a deep dive into Juche.
Joe,
Right, Juche. It's North Korea's state ideology. Now, it's a term you've probably heard bandied about, but maybe, not fully grasped.
yeah, it gets mentioned, but often without much context.
Exactly. So our mission here is to sift through a stack of sources, pull out the really important nuggets, and help you become genuinely well-informed about this really complex and often kind of baffling ideology.
We'll look at where it came from, its core ideas, how it plays out in practice, and even its surprising global reach.
So at its core, what does Juche actually mean?
Well, the basic translation is something like subject idea, or, more commonly, self-reliance. Officially, they trace it back to Kim Il-sung's experiences fighting the Japanese in the Down with Imperialism Union.
Okay, so revolutionary roots, but when did it become, the official thing?
The first time it was really laid out as the ideology and documentation was 1955. Kim Il-sung gave a speech on eliminating dogmatism and formalism and establishing Juche in ideological work.
Catchy title.
Huh, yeah. But it's known as the Juche speech. Super important work for them. Really locked it in.
And it wasn't just talk, right? You mentioned the calendar.
That's right. That's a very concrete example, the Juche calendar. They brought it in on July 8th, 1997.
Why that date?
It's the third anniversary of Kim Il-sung's death. Then it went into public use on September 9th, which is their Republic Foundation Day.
So how does it work if I look at a North Korean newspaper today?
Okay, so any year before 1912, that's Kim Il-sung's birth year, they just use the normal Gregorian date. But years after 1912, those are Juche years.
Yeah.
You just take the Gregorian year and subtract 1911.
So right now, 2025, that would be.
Juche 14.
Wow, just think about that. Shaping your entire nation's timeline around one person. That's a powerful statement.
It really is. The insight here isn't just, oh, a weird calendar. It's saying Kim Il-sung isn't just a leader, he's the start of their modern reality.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Let's peel back the layers now. The core principles. Political independence and military self-reliance. Let's start with political independence, Jaju. What's that about?
Jaju. Yeah, it emphasizes equality between nations, mutual respect, every country's right to decide its own path.
So standing up for yourself.
Exactly. It's the opposite of what they call saida-chui. That's the idea of relying on a bigger power. Jaju means resisting foreign pressure, resisting intervention, protecting sovereignty.
Okay, that makes sense. But self-reliance, doesn't that sound a bit isolationist? How do they square that with needing allies or learning from others?
That's a really good point. But no, Juche doesn't actually mean total isolation. It encourages cooperation, especially between socialist states.
Okay.
Kim Jong-il himself wrote about this. On the Juche idea, he says, independence is not in conflict with internationalism, but is the basis of its strengthening.
Interesting. So be strong first, then cooperate.
Pretty much. Kim Il-sung admitted they needed to learn from, say, the Soviets and China. But, crucially, not just blindly copy them, he warned against swallowing things of others undigested or imitating them mechanically.
Right. He credited their early successes to doing things their own way.
Exactly. Independent policymaking by the Workers' Party, the WPK.
So, being strong enough to choose your own path and partners. Which brings us neatly to military self-reliance, Jawi. How key is that part?
Oh, absolutely fundamental. They see it as essential for maintaining that political independence, the Jaju.
How so?
Well, if you rely on other countries for weapons, you're dependent, right? So Jawi means you must develop your own domestic defense industry.
Avoid being beholden to arms suppliers.
Precisely. Kim Jong-il even said, look, military aid from allies, fine. But it only really works if you're already strong militarily yourself.
Okay, let's ground this in history. How did this independence and self-reliance play out during the Cold War with the big players, Moscow and Beijing?
Well, even though they had close ties, North Korea consistently pushed back against what they saw as interference.
Like what?
There was a big moment in 1956. A challenge to Kim Il-sung's leadership, seen as having Soviet and Chinese backing, failed.
And the result?
A purge. Pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese elements kicked out of the WPK. They also rejected de-Stalinization when Khrushchev started it. But interestingly, they managed to avoid taking sides when China and the Soviet Union split.
Walking a tightrope.
very carefully maintaining that independent line.
Okay, so Juche clearly shapes things inside North Korea. But did they want to keep it just for themselves? Did Kim Il-sung see this as something exportable?
Oh, absolutely. He definitely believed the principles of Juche could work outside Korea. He actively promoted it to the Third World
As well.
as an anti-imperialist ideology, specifically the counter to U.S. imperialism. North Korea was presented as, like, a development model. This was big in the 60s and 70s.
Did they make actual connections? Trade, diplomacy?
They did, yeah. Trade and consular relations with places like Indonesia, India,
Yeah.
signed trade deals with Guinea, Mali, Ghana in Africa.
Any standouts there?
And Guinea's interesting. It was the first sub-Saharan African country they established full diplomatic relations with. That was way back in October 1958.
Now, you mentioned surprising connections. Was everyone in the socialist camp thrilled about North Korea pushing Juche globally?
No, not at all. Enver Hoxha, the leader of Albania, who was famously critical of almost everyone, he slammed Kim Il-sung's efforts,
What did he say?
called them pretensions, accused Kim of basically working with everyone he saw as enemies, Taoists, U.S. imperialists, even Soviet and Chinese social imperialists.
Well, shows the fractures in that world.
Definitely. Deep ideological divides.
You also mentioned Vietnam. That seems like a key relationship. How did the Vietnam War influence Kim's thinking?
Hugely. North Korea identified strongly with Vietnam right from the start of U.S. intervention in '61. When Vietnam was unified in 1975, Kim Il-sung saw it as a hopeful sign for Korea's own future.
He thought Korea could reunify the same way.
He seemed to. He gave this big speech in Beijing, said Asia was on a high tide of revolution. And then he said, if war started in Korea, we will only lose the military demarcation line and will gain the country's reunification.
That's incredibly bold. So the mid-70s were really their moment on the world stage.
You could say that. It was the peak of their diplomatic push into the Third World and non-aligned countries. They formally joined the non-aligned movement, NAM, in 1975.
And even served on its leadership body.
Yep, served on the NAM Bureau that same year.
Okay, this brings us to something fascinating. You mentioned earlier the strange bedfellows that arose because of the Sino-Soviet split, particularly in Africa.
Right. This is where pure ideology gets messy. Take Angola. There was the Soviet-backed MPLA fighting for power.
Okay.
And then there was the FNLA, which actually got support from the U.S.
And North Korea sided with...
The FNLA, the U.S.-backed group, against the Soviet-backed one.
So indirectly aligned with the U.S. against the Soviets.
In that specific context, yeah. It shows how complex those proxy conflicts became.
It's pretty startling, though. And it wasn't just Angola, right? The sources mention support for some less savory characters.
This is where the pragmatism really shows. They supported leaders like Mobutu and Zaire, Idi Amin and Uganda.
Seriously, Idi Amin.
Yep. And Bokassa, the guy who declared himself Emperor of the Central African Republic. North Korean engineers even built a presidential palace for President Bagaza in Burundi in the late 70s.
Wow. For an ideology supposedly about anti-imperialism, how do the sources explain backing these right-wing dictators? Was it purely tactical?
Overwhelmingly tactical seems to be the consensus. It wasn't about shared ideology. It was about gaining influence, finding allies wherever they could, countering rivals like the Soviets, or just, pragmatic statecraft.
It really drives home that point, doesn't it? Juche wasn't always a rigid dogma in foreign policy.
Not at all. Often a very flexible tool for geopolitical gain. Self-preservation and influence seemed paramount, even if it meant these unsavory alliances.
And it wasn't just diplomatic support. They sent troops.
Significant military aid. One estimate suggests around 8,000 North Korean military personnel were sent to 38 different countries between 66 and 83.
And training.
Yep. Around 7,000 personnel from 30 countries got training in North Korea during that time.
Any specific examples?
About 1,000 North Koreans were in Angola, for instance.
Yeah.
And their aid to Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe was apparently quite important in helping him consolidate power early on.
And there was even a defense treaty.
A mutual defense treaty with Libya, signed in 1982. That's unique, the only country besides the USSR and China they had such a formal treaty with.
Okay, let's shift from military to economic diplomacy. You mentioned an interesting case with East Germany, the GDR.
Yes, in the 1980s, there was some significant economic cooperation there. Kim Il-sung was apparently quite candid with the East German leader, Erich Honecker.
About what?
Basically said, look, we've got a trade deficit, we're having trouble repaying loans, can we work together? He suggested cooperation in mining. GDR provides the tech, North Korea provides the labor and the raw metals.
A classic kind of deal. What was the GDR's take?
Well, Honecker talked up East Germany's own success, its self-reliance despite U.S. embargoes, becoming a top industrial nation. They framed it within their own narrative of strength.
Did actual projects come out of it?
They did. They built an automation equipment plant together in Pyongyang, opened in '83, also worked on textile plants, with the GDR providing equipment on credit.
And you said Kim Il-sung was surprisingly frank about their own issues.
Remarkably so, according to the sources. He criticized his own officials for not knowing enough about East German industry.
Really?
Yeah. He admitted they'd, unofficially bought an unfinished semiconductor plant from Japan and didn't even realize the GDR made good synthetic rubber or herbicide stuff they'd been buying from the West.
That's quite an admission.
He stressed they had to change, use the socialist bloc connections better, especially with North Korea's rich mineral deposits, lead, zinc, magnesite. Said it was crucial to beat the economic war by reducing reliance on capitalist imports.
Okay, let's pivot again. How does Juche work inside North Korea? As more than just policy, but like the social fabric, almost like a religion.
That's a really important aspect.
Yeah.
Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung's son, really developed this side. He argued that Marxism-Leninism was kind of stuck, limited by its age, its European origins.
Jinza Korea.
Exactly. He said North Korea, coming from a backward, colonial, semi-feudal society, couldn't just copy Marxism based on European capitalism or Leninism based on Russia. So Juche was born out of their specific needs.
So a bespoke ideology, tailor-made.
That's how it was presented. He said Kim Il-sung created original lines and policies suited to our people's aspirations and the specific situation. Then he called Juche a revolutionary theory, which occupies the highest stage of development of the revolutionary ideology of the working class.
Highest stage. So better than Marx.
That's the implication. And this led to socialism of our style, which he explicitly called a man-centered socialism.
Man-centered. How's that different?
It breaks from the Marxist idea that economic forces, material conditions, are the main drivers of history. Instead, it puts human consciousness, independence, creativity embodied by the leader at the center.
And that leads to this concept of the single sociopolitical organism. What on earth is that?
Yeah, it's a key phrase. The idea is that the political and ideological might is nothing but the power of single-hearted unity between the leader, the party, and the masses.
So everyone's merged.
In this view, yes. The leader of the party and the masses throw in their lot with one another, forming a single socio-political organism. The leader becomes the brain, the party, the nerves, the masses, the body, all acting as one.
That really elevates the leader. Has that emphasis shifted at all recently? I know there was the Songun or military first period.
Right, so gun became dominant when the National Defense Commission was made the top state body in '98. But more recently, in late 2021, Kim Jong-un announced a shift away from Songun towards people-first politics in Haejung-Jiljui with himself, naturally, as the guide.
Now, you mentioned comparisons to religion. That's fascinating. What do scholars point to?
They see overlaps or perhaps appropriations from different traditions, elements of Christianity, maybe Cheondoism, which is a native Korean religion, and definitely Confucianism.
Like, well, specifically.
The big commemorations for Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, they liken those to Confucian ancestor worship rituals. And some compare the intense collective fervor shown for the leader to the ecstatic state found in Korean shamanic rituals called gut.
So not strictly political ideology, more quasi-religious.
That's how many outside observers frame it, yes.
And I bet traditional Marxists aren't fans of this focus on the leader.
Definitely not. Western Marxists criticize this heavily. They see the focus on the leader's sacred role, the popular worship, as totally non-Marxist, undemocratic. They argue it basically robs the working class of its historical agency.
Can you see this religious behavior in action somewhere specific?
The Aeron Festival is often cited as a prime example. Those massive, synchronized gymnastic and artistic performances in Pyongyang.
The mass games.
Exactly. Scholars analyze everything about it, how performers are chosen, the themes, the publicity, and compare it to aspects of a huge national religious ceremony.
How so?
It's seen as the state literally appropriating a mass of bodies for performances that represent the leader as the benevolent father figure and the participants as his loyal, devoted children.
And does it work? Does it create that loyalty?
The analysis suggests it's very effective. It drills in that collectivist idea, one for all and all for one. It builds strong emotional bonds, intense loyalty to the leader. And apparently this is reinforced by things like intense training, physical punishment, and making the whole unit accountable. It kind of embeds the leader cult deep into people's minds and bodies.
Okay, so we've seen Juche's origins, principles, global reach, and its role as this internal social glue. Let's turn to how it's perceived and criticized more broadly. Are there debates about whether it's even Marxist anymore?
Oh, big time.
Yeah.
A major criticism is that Juche is basically just extreme nationalism wearing socialist clothes, that it's fundamentally departed from core Marxist-Leninist ideas.
Any specific comparisons?
Some critics, like Brian Reynolds Myers, an American scholar of Korea, go pretty far. He argues Juche has much more in common with Japanese fascism and ultranationalism than with Marxism.
Wow, that's a strong claim. Based on what?
He points to things like intense, race-based nationalism and hypermilitarism as parallels.
But surely not everyone agrees with that interpretation.
No, definitely not. You have others, like the American historian Derek R. Ford, who argue the opposite. He stresses the continuity between Marxism-Leninism and Juche.
And his take?
He actually credits Juche as the guiding ideology that allowed North Korea to survive when the whole Eastern Bloc collapsed in the late 80s and early 90s.
So completely different views. How do you reconcile those? What does that tell us?
It tells you just how contested the interpretation of North Korea and Juche is. Depending on what aspects you emphasize, you can see it as a radical break, an adaptation, or even a unique continuation. It really shapes how you understand their whole path.
Are there other ideologies Juche gets compared to?
Sometimes it's compared to Baathism.
The Arab nationalist ideology.
Yeah, the one advocating a unified Arab state based on socialism and self-reliance. There are some rhetorical similarities, especially with the Syrian version, though Juche is generally seen as having a much more developed, unique ideological foundation.
Any other surprising comparisons?
Well, there was that one from Benjamin Zeiker, an economist at the Conservative American Enterprise Institute. He actually wrote that Donald Trump's political ideology shared some similarities with Juche.
Trump. How?
Specifically, the emphasis on isolationism and autarky, or economic self-sufficiency. A provocative comparison, for sure.
Definitely raises eyebrows. Okay, let's end with something really visual. You mentioned a North Korean world map that apparently embodies Juche.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
quite something. It seems to be a decorative map, but the way it's drawn is incredibly revealing.
How so?
First off, North Korea is massive, right in the center and highlighted in bright red, clearly signaling it's the most important place.
Okay, putting yourself center stage. What else?
The distortions are wild. Newfoundland off the coast of Canada just gone missing entirely.
Seriously, wiped off the map.
And Israel is, quote, completely obliterated from the earth, which reflects their political stance. They don't recognize Israel, call it an imperialist satellite state, and recognize Palestine instead.
Wow. That's ideology made literal. Any other weird bits?
The Suez Canal looks enormous. The Great Lakes in North America, the Mediterranean Sea, heavily distorted, and Africa looks incredibly small compared to its actual size.
So sizes and shapes are all warped around.
Around Korea, the Korean peninsula itself looks gigantic. And importantly, it includes South Korea, also colored red.
Reflecting their claim over the whole peninsula.
Exactly. Which, to be fair, South Korea also claims. But the map visually asserts the North's perspective.
Now, obviously, all flat maps have some distortion.
True, projecting a sphere onto a flat surface always involves compromises. But the level and nature of the distortion here, especially how extreme it gets the closer you are to current IA, strongly suggest it's not just a cartographic choice.
It's a message.
It's an intentional political and social message. It's a visual representation of Juche, of how North Korea sees itself literally the center of the world with everything else sized and placed relative to it.
That map really provides a core insight, doesn't it? It's not just bad map making.
Not at all. It's like a visual manifesto. It shows you Juche in action, defining their reality, placing North Korea as the absolute focus of existence.
So there you have it, our deep dive into Juche. It started, didn't it, as this straightforward idea of self-reliance.
Born out of struggle.
And it evolved into this incredibly complex, all-encompassing, quasi-religious state ideology. It shapes everything, their diplomacy, their military, life at home, how they even see themselves on a map.
Yeah, full of those surprising twists, contradictions, and global ripples we talked about.
It really leaves you thinking, I think, about the sheer power of a national ideology, how it can define reality, even, bend it and distort it.
Absolutely. And how understanding that self-perception, like seeing it laid bare on their world map, can actually give you critical insights into why they act the way they do on the world stage. It helps make sense of their unique, often isolated path.
Maybe something for you, listening, to mull over. How did this deep dive stack up against what you thought you knew? Does it challenge and maybe confirm your own ideas about self-reliance or nationalism or how nations see their place in the world?